The decision to run. What sort of a person makes the decision to become a fugitive? To leave family and friends behind, to abandon an identity and community, to become hunted? I can't imagine such a decision is taken lightly. I know it wasn't an easy decision for my dad. He had never intended to become a fugitive in the first place. He, like most criminals, committed a crime with the intention of not getting caught. Most criminals act hoping to get away with it one way or the other, either never getting fingered for the job in the first place or making themselves scarce before the police can detain them. Eddie Mayer, one of Britain's most wanted men for 19 years after the Securicorps van job in 1994, always knew he'd eventually be fingered for the job and planned to escape the country as soon as possible after the crime and never return. The decision to run was part of the job, and as we'll discover, there are many reasons a person decides to run. One of them is that it's in their character to run. Chapter 1. Character. In setting out to understand the mind of a fugitive, there's no better place to start than by talking to a man whose job it is to get inside the criminal mind. Professor Paul Britton is an expert criminal profiler, having spent more than 20 years working as a consultant clinical and forensic psychologist, as well as being the former head of the Regional Forensic Psychologist Service for Trent. He previously advised the Home Office and Association of Chief Police Officers Crime Committee on offender profiling and currently teaches clinical and forensic psychology at Birmingham City University. I began by asking him if he felt certain types of people were more likely to be flight risks and if he felt it was possible to spot them in advance.
I think everything depends on whether or not a person believes that they have been identified in some way, so that they have reason to think they will come to me because they know who I am. And then what you have are different personality characteristics that probably determine how folks respond. Now, some people they have to be bright enough, so there has to be a modicum of intelligence if they're going to make it happen at all. So there are some people who think, I'm strong enough to get away with this. That's not too many, to be honest, but if they do, they've got to have somewhere to go. Now, if these are people who have committed a crime on impulse, then it's usually not too well done. So they usually put themselves in circumstances where they are apprehended fairly quickly. If you have someone who is much more experienced, who is more planful, then they may, even before the event took place, they may have thought this through and have looked at ways forward and ways out. On the other hand, it may be that they see something is going wrong in the crime, the event that they've organized, and then they think, now's the time for me to do something about it. If they think they can, if they've got somewhere to go, if they've got some resources, then they are likely to have a go at that. But also to do that, now I have to be careful here because it does take some courage. If they have any foresight, they will know that what they're undertaking is very difficult. If they are people who are manipulative, they may not care so much. They may have less care for how this impacts upon other people. And on cases I've looked at, they actually manipulate other people in order to put them in a position where they support the person who is evading. Now, if they're not in that position, if they've thought a little bit more deeply, then they have to have some planfulness. And what you have then is circumstances that are determined by the resources that they have, by the way that they know the world that they're going in, and by what they think their pursuer knows of that world. For example, if you have someone who is some sort of aristocrat and he needs to flee now, it may be the case that he has wide resources that he can go to and not be seen so easily, because there may be people who, if you like, pull in behind him. Now, in another world, there are people who see the world. They have different pictures of the world and how it is. If they think of themselves as different, fundamentally not of the ordinary society, and in a sense that they capitalize on whatever's available to them, then they may start running. And you're looking then at people who have a modicum of intellect. You're looking at people who have some self-confidence, some planfulness, some way of managing resources, but much, much more importantly, one of two things. Either they have to be able to take people with them, and I don't necessarily mean physically, I mean to carry their psychological support with them, or alternatively, they have to be entirely solo and know that they can do this and get farther and farther away where they're not going to be recognized. It's quite a difficult thing to do.
So the character of the man, and most fugitives are men, is crucial. Charismatic, confident, organised, but perhaps reckless. Do they also need to be brave? Not according to Britain's most famous fugitive hunter, Peter Blexley. Peter joined the Metropolitan Police in 1978, and while serving as a detective at Kensington and Chelsea, he began to develop a skill for undercover work. This led him to become a founding member of SO10, Scotland Yard's most secretive undercover squad. Since leaving the police, Peter has become one of the country's most renowned and successful fugitive hunters. He's been the chief on Channel 4's Hunted and has written several acclaimed books on fugitives. I began by asking Peter whether there were any recognisable factors in a fugitive's personality.
Yeah, especially if they've legged it before. And some people, persistently are too cowardly to face the consequences of their crimes and go to court and accept their punishment. So they do simply go on the run. Some get a lot of publicity because they're very dangerous, remembering, of course, that the police's core role is to protect life and property. So if somebody's on the run and they're regarded as being a huge danger potentially, perhaps they've committed murder or very serious assault and they think they'll do the same again, then they'll be the ones that get splashed up on the news at 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock and be all across the papers.
But surely I'd have thought in a case like that, if someone's high profile and they're all over the media, surely, I'm speaking of if it was myself, and I think if you're going to be all over the papers, it's hard enough to go on the run today anyway, what with social media, facial recognition, this and everything. Most people I would have thought today, if I said they were high profile, knowing that they're going to be in all the papers, they'd be better off just going to prison and doing the time, wouldn't they?
Only 2 weeks ago, a notorious Italian criminal, mafiosa, who'd been wanted for 30 years, got captured. So, of course, when he first went on the run, it was very much in the sort of analogue age, with very little CCTV, no such thing as social media, the internet in its real infancy and not available widely, no facial recognition. He went on the run and he's been through that analogue age, very much into the digital age, and was successfully on the trot for 30 years. It can be done, and it is done. There are a number of people, despite all the tools that you would think are at law enforcement's hands, they still successfully go on the run and stay on the trot for years, unfortunately.
I find it fascinating to hear a police officer's view on fugitives. Peter uses the word cowardice about those on the run not facing justice. Was my father a coward for running and not facing his tariff? That's certainly not how he would have seen it, but I can see Peter's point of view. From a law enforcement perspective, a fugitive appears not willing or brave enough to take the consequences of their actions. Perhaps the extent to which it's bravery or cowardice depends on what the preconceived idea of life on the run will be. If the criminal believes life on the run is the Ronnie Biggs experience, sun, sea, sand and cervezas, then is it brave to opt for that? But if their vision is the Hollywood version, wanted posters, border checks and helicopters with searchlights, then perhaps it is a brave decision to run. One of the UK's foremost crime journalists certainly agrees. As a Guardian's crime correspondent and chair of the Crime Reporters Association, Duncan Campbell has been interviewing and covering crime and criminals for over 50 years. He sees them in a different light.
I think there's a mixture of people who go on the run. There are those who are completely desperate and they know that they're going to go away for a long time if they're convicted. And there are the chancers. What I found in talking to people who have escaped and who have been on the run is that for some it was a hobby. How did you get out? How did you keep on the run? And for others, it was a matter of desperation. I have also met people who were on the run who were purely on the run in order to claim that they were victims of miscarriages of justice. One particular case was in 1993. Somebody called Joe Steele, who'd been convicted of the murder of 6 people in what were known as the Ice Cream Wars in Glasgow, escaped from Saughton prison in Edinburgh, and he came down to London. I was working then at The Guardian, and he was anxious that people should know why he had escaped and why he was innocent. So he came to The Guardian, he told the story, he explained that he was an innocent man, he explained that he could, if he had been guilty, now that he was free, could have gone across to Spain. It was quite easy in those days, and he could have hidden out there. But he merely wanted to talk to a journalist so that he could expose that he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. But it was a lesson to me about how, for some people, the most important thing about being on the run is explaining to the world why they shouldn't be behind bars in the first place.
That last example from Duncan is really interesting. Someone going and staying on the run as a means of demonstrating and proving their innocence. It makes you think of Harrison Ford in The Fugitive, or Matt Damon in the Jason Bourne films. Having heard Duncan make that point about the fugitive Joe Steele back in 1993, I thought it would be a good idea to see if I could get access to someone who is on the run in order to protest their innocence, yet who is doing it right now in the modern day. Unfortunately, I have been able to get access to a fugitive who is, right now, actively protesting his innocence. His name is Zahed Khan. Zahed, originally from Birmingham, has been living in Dubai on the run from the British authorities since June 2018. And here, in his own words, is how that came to be the case.
I was arrested for a registration number plate fraud. The amount of that fraud, which they alleged that I had done, was, £85,000. According to the fraud industry, it's quite small. So I was under investigation for almost 2.5 years. Whilst I was under investigation, I was interviewed 9 separate occasions. And every occasion, the prosecution said no further action. No further action. So the police officer was getting frustrated, and he knew that he really didn't have success of getting me convicted. At the same time, I had Ferraris and all the nice fancy cars, and I was driving this Ferrari for almost 2 years. One random day, I get stopped by about 13 police officers, and they seize my car. And the reason for the seizing it is they first say I got a firearm on me, but I told the officers, none of you officers have got any guns or your firearm approved, so you have got no right to stop me if that was the real reason. So then they changed the story and they said the car's stolen. I go, perfect. If the car's stolen, then surely you're taking the car, then take me with the car. I must be the thief that's stolen the car. Then why are you not arresting me? They go, no, we just want the car. It didn't make sense what they were doing. Either way, they wanted to take that car off me. The purpose of that car taken off me was officer spent a lot of money in them 2 years investigating me. He wanted to prove to his superiors that, look, our money hasn't gone wasted. We've done something out of it. We've got some achievement from it. So he takes my car. The next day, they go and destroy it, or the couple of days after. The same officer overrides the CPS decision, which says no further action, and he charges me. So now we've got a Ferrari issue, and now we've got a criminal case that's pending, right? So now we're 4 weeks into me being in custody. I have not a single document given to me. After 4 weeks, the judge says to me, Mr. Khan, I am sympathetic in the situation you are in. What do we do? They released me, and I knew, I'm fighting a losing battle. The jury have seen only what they presented. I wasn't able to show my side. I spent half the time in custody with no papers. That's when I flew out on a private jet. I told them, listen, guys, I ain't having none of that. I flew out, went to Dubai. I sent a video to the judge explaining why I left the UK. And I blamed him for it. I told him, you're to blame. You left me in a situation where I fought every second of that case from my heart. I had no intention to leave because they'd done me dirty. I had no choice. But if I knew I was guilty of a crime, I would have never left. I would have faced the music. Or if they gave me a fair shake with my Ferrari and let me use all the evidence, I would have remained. Because, justice is there for that reason. I would have faced the music, whatever circumstances I was put in. But because they'd done me half-heartedly and done me dirty, I had to walk away.
I was interested to know at what point the idea of going on the run came to him, and at what point did he feel the case was going so badly that it was better to run.
In custody, I'd made application for bail. I was getting refused every time. At that point of time, I thought, if I get released, depending on what they do to me and give me my fair shake, I had no intention of going. But the day they released me is the day I realized that there's no way of me surviving this car crash. They basically continued this case without certain evidence coming to light. There was pending investigations for certain emails that basically I was accused of. And they were pending. And they continued, told the jury, put that on a back burner. So at that moment, I knew that, I'm on a dead end here. I have to get out of here. So I thought the safest place for me was to be in Dubai. That's when I got on the plane. So not an easy situation to be in. And I've been doing this for the last 5 years now. And it's been hell of a journey. But let me tell you one thing. I've maintained myself well. I presented myself well. And I've been fighting full force because I know it's only me who's going to do it. And I ain't doing it to prove a point to the public. I'm not doing it to get a name for myself. I'm doing it to clear my name, to prove that I was innocent. And our justice system, which is supposed to be the best system in the world, is actually toxic. It's basically, we've got rotten apples within the system where we have to clear out. And a lot of people are scared not to go against the establishment. And that's one thing that I was not going to be prepared to be scared.
Chapter 2. The Music. When my dad planned his heist, the idea was not to be caught. He was a very intelligent criminal and always had a plan B up his sleeve. But when he committed the great train robbery, he was not planning to spend the next half a decade on the run. It was the music that ultimately made the decision for him. Within a month of the heist, the police had his name, and when he saw the 30-year sentences being handed out to his accomplices, then he, and others who had yet to be caught like Buster Edwards and Charlie Wilson, felt they had no choice but to run. Equally, it was a draconian 30-year sentence that persuaded another of the robbers, Ronnie Biggs, to break out of Wandsworth and go on the run himself. Ronnie's great friend and co-author of his autobiography, Chris Pickard, recounts his story.
I think in terms of the after the great train robbery, it was probably one of the failings of the entire plan. And I think Bruce would have admitted to that they really hadn't thought through, well, you get all this money. What do you then do? The original plan was to sit at Leatherslade Farm and stay there up to a couple of weeks. But of course, they were never expecting to have that much money or make that much impact from the robbery. And certainly someone like Ron, who hadn't been involved for crime for a while, he'd have just thought, right, we're going to hold up the train, I'll get some money, I'll go home afterwards, and then we'll deal with it. I'll bring the money a little by little into circulation, as they did in those days. And of course, we are talking, it was cash then, not credit cards and everything. But it was just the sheer amount of money. So once they had them, and again, people have asked, as Bruce and I did, why didn't they just take the money abroad or take it somewhere else? Why did they go back to the farm? But of course, the answer to that is they were all criminals and nobody trusted each other. So Bruce needed to count the money in front of all the gang that had been there at the track, give them their money, and then send them on their way. And they were so disorganized. It was Roger Caudry, who ran the other gang to Bruce's, the South Coast Raiders, who'd had the foresight to bring a bicycle with him. And he got on his bike and actually cycled into Oxford to organise a car for him and then make a few phone calls. And after that, they would go out and make phone calls and bring other people in to pick each of them up with their money because, of course, this was kit bags full of money. And also with Roger going out, he was able to report back there weren't any police roadblocks up or, they'd see police cars going about the place occasionally, but there was no sign that they couldn't move out of the farm and go to other places.
So, when did Ron realise he had to go on the run?
Well, Ron, unlike Bruce always had a plan after robberies to get, well, we should say, the hell out of Dodge. He after, say, the airport job, he was immediately on a plane to France. The top guys all knew the best thing to do is get off the manor, as they would say, and just disappear. Ron really didn't have that background, so he just returned home with his money and didn't really think much about it. He separated it out with some friends, but he just thought he'd be fine. And especially when the first arrests came, he still felt fairly safe because he wasn't particularly a known criminal. And in fact, the first time the police ever visited him was on the basis that he was a friend of Bruce Reynolds, and the police were pretty sure Bruce was involved in the crime. So they turned up on Ron's doorstep in Red Hill to say, have you seen Bruce recently? To which obviously Ron lied, and luckily the Great Train Robbery being such a big crime, you didn't have to deny knowing about it. So Ron could happily say to a policeman, oh yeah, I read about that. Oh, you think Bruce is involved? And so Ron didn't have any plan to go running or hide. He just thought he'd sit it out. And of course, until the police visited him another time, arrested him and charged him with a Great Train Robbery. And even then, all those guys thought that they'd go through the trial and might get 10, 15 years for the crime. In which case, for the money they got, it would have been worth their while serving their time in prison because there was no parole at the time. If you're going to get 10 or 15 years, it would probably turn out to be that time. So in Ron's case, he wasn't yet planning to go on the run. That all slightly changed when the judge decides to give 30 years to the Great Train Robbers, when that wasn't even being given to murderers or spies and things. It was unheard of to give 30-year sentences, which they all received. Even at that stage, Ron realised when he went to prison that he was suddenly treated as a hero. He was suddenly this top-of-the-ladder criminal without particularly doing anything. And all these people in prison outraged by the sentences and saying, you must escape. You can't possibly serve 30 years. And of course, part of that story is people like Buster and Bruce, who hadn't been captured, they were following the trial to see, well, if it had been 10-year sentences or 15 or something, it might have been worth their while giving themselves up and clearing the slate and starting again. But, Bruce was one. As soon as he saw it was 30 years and Buster, they all left Britain. Bruce went off to Mexico, Buster as well. So Ron arrived in Wandsworth. Again, lots of people saying to him, you need to escape, you need to go on the run. But Ron, at that time, kept thinking, this is too complicated. I'm going to sit it out and see if parole comes in. At the time Ron was sentenced, he had Charmian, his long-suffering wife, as people know, and he already had 2 little boys. He had Nick and Chris. And it was really because of the birth of Chris, his second son, was why Ron wanted to get involved in the robbery, because he saw the amounts of expense that having children is. Ron had said to Charmian he was going to see if he could sit it out for if it was going to be 10 years or so. But then he quickly realised it wasn't going to happen. What's important for people to realise was in the 1960s, it was not if you could escape, it was when you could escape. None of the guys at the top level of crime believed a British prison could hold them. They were all totally convinced there were ways to get out of a prison, and you just had to work them out. Now, Ron was offered some crazy ones. One he said he really liked was a guy who wanted to bring a helicopter in and pick him up from the yard. And then Ron thought about it and thought, even for him, Ron, it was sort of nuts. And he thought, no, I think I'll pass on that one. In Ron's case, it was a man called Paul Seaborn who had escaped from many prisons. And his thing was, it was an outrage. Ron had 30 years and he needed to get Ron out. And that was his sort of passion. But Paul was not a man who would think about what do you do once you get over the wall.
I knew Ron well, and I can tell you now that he wasn't the kind to think about things too much in advance. I asked Chris if Ron had a plan for what to do next.
No, it's fair to say Ron really hadn't thought what he was going to do when he went over the wall of Wandsworth. And by luck and by chance, he decided when he was in prison in Wandsworth, he realised it wasn't a one-man job. It wasn't just him going over the wall. So he looked for friends, people that he had met in prison previously, to join him on this adventure. And one who's very famous is Roy Shaw, who turned up in Wandsworth, and Ron had a chat with him, and Roy thought about it. Roy, being a really top-level criminal, actually said to Ron, I can't do it. I don't have the money to pay for myself going on the run. You do, I don't. I need to sit it out and think through it again. But there was somebody in there who Ron was path across with, which was a man called Eric Flower, who was, again, a top-level operator. Eric was already in his mind thinking, right, once we go over the wall, we need this, and this. But he wasn't telling Ron that. He was just thought, let's get over the wall, and then I'll explain what we're going to do.
It remains one of my favourite Ron stories. My dad used to laugh about it with us. It was ridiculously simple in the end. Chris explains how Ron got over the wall.
With a rope, Ron escaped from Wandsworth in the best traditions of old movies. It was a rope ladder. Strangely, they were followed by 3 extra men who decided to take advantage. If there's a rope ladder down the wall, why not go as well? And they followed them up and went over.
For Ronnie and my dad, these sentences had a clear impact on their decisions to run. My dad later claimed that had the sentences been lower, he might have stayed to do his time. I'm not so sure myself. I think he was too hooked on a life of adventure, but facing 30 years certainly made it an easier decision. It was also a factor for the man once dubbed Britain's greatest fraudster by the British tabloid media. Tony Sales was facing a 4-year sentence when he was caught back in the early 2000s. Rather than face his time, he did a runner before sentencing, managing to avoid capture for 6 years. I caught up with Tony and he explained how he found himself in the hands of the law and how the time inside impacted his decision to run.
I was running a team in Sheffield, and we were basically getting LCD and plasma screen TVs. They're just kind of new to the market back then. They've just come out. And we found a loophole in the finance system that allowed us to apply for credit in other people's names. You could make fraudulent documents, produce them as identification, and you didn't need to leave a deposit or anything. You could take them away from the store. You know, some of those items were £5,000 a time. And we was out in Sheffield, like I said. We went to a place called Meadowhall in Sheffield, and we'd been grafting all day, kind of hitting loads of different retailers and getting loads of different types of things, from phones to Rolex watches to, condenser tumble dryers. We had like a whole load of different things in the van. A sales assistant in a shop, became suspicious of so many cockneys going up to the counter and buying the exact same TV, the same model, and kind of just gave a little ding to the on-site police at Meadowhall there, and they kind of focused their attention on us for a bit, saw what we was up to, waited till we had pulled out another TV out of the same shop, and then just kind of come on us. And, they kind of bowed us. We got arrested, got bowed. I went for a whole load of different bits and pieces, and then we get to the going back. They charge us with conspiracy to defraud ultimately. And, they found my fingerprints on like hundreds of documents that they found in the van. And it's at that point, I kind of like, my brief was, talking that I could face 5 years for this, as we're going into interview and all that, kind of shaking us up a bit, I think. I don't know what she was doing. And I knew I was guilty. I was banged to rights. There was no getting out of it. I'd done what I'd done, and I'm always a big believer in kind of putting your hands up when you know that you're wrong. especially in those circumstances, because otherwise you're only going to damage yourself. You're going to end up serving longer in prison because you didn't go not guilty if you know they've really got you, and their evidence was overwhelming. They definitely had us. And so eventually we end up going for pleas and Ds, and I plead guilty because, I'm banged to rights. I know I'm banged to rights. And then I'm just waiting on one of my co-defendants for his trial. And his trial goes bad. He actually went not guilty, and then he got 3 days into the trial and realised that the trial was going bad and decided that he was going to jump bail and go on the run. And then he jumped bail and went on the run. And then him and I had a conversation in the background of, because once he was found guilty, we knew that then it would go to sentencing. Up until that point, I thought I was going to probably get between 3 and 4 years for my part in the conspiracy because of what the brief had said and all the kind of stuff that we knew. And then one of my other co-defendants, he'd gone guilty with me. We got the sentencing day. And on the first day that they called us back to go to sentencing, I rung the court up and pretended that I was ill because I didn't want to go. I just was kind of I needed a couple more days just to think about it, and just to think about what I was going to do. So I knew that I could ring them and extend the time. I'd been good. The behaviour I displayed was not bad. It was only good, so they would accept it, which they did. And then it got to the Wednesday, and I decided that I definitely weren't going to go back, and so decided to jump bail with my co-defendant. Two of us out of that trial went on the run. It was, the first day I went and sat I live in South London, and I drove over to East London because, if you come from South, you only know, just a few people. It's very rare that you know, everyone in an area. You might know a couple of people in and out, but you're not going to know everyone. I'm certainly not going to know the police over there, and they're not going to know me. Not that I was known to them in that way anyway, but in your head, that's how you justify all the stuff that you're doing to yourself. And so I drove over to East London and spent the whole day in a cafe just drinking tea and, thinking, they're going to go round. And then I stayed out for a couple of weeks. I was just staying out, I wouldn't go home. And then they eventually went round to my nan's house to see if I was there. And she just said, he's not here, he's out. I don't know where he's gone. He's been gone for a couple of weeks. I've not seen him. And they said, where's his clothes? She brought him in, showed where the clothes was, shut the cupboard. She was quite clued up, my nan. And that was it. They disappeared. And then from that moment on, I was on the run, I guess, for 6 years it lasted.
So Tony, like my father and Zahed, hadn't planned to be on the run. Their decisions were influenced by the sentences they were facing. In the case of Tony and Zahed, they were not particularly long sentences, certainly when compared to what my father faced. But to them they were long enough given context. And that context was another thing that linked them. They all had families. My dad was also a family man at heart. He loved my mum and me, and I think being apart from us was another big factor.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.